whereas with climate change, there's no surviving it if we let it get beyond about, well, certainly beyond, if it gets to 3 degrees or 4 degrees, which Nordhaus calls optimal, we won't have this conversation because most likely we'll be dead and the technology won't work.
Professor Steve Keen is a distinguished research fellow at University College London, economist and author. While he is one of the few economists to correctly and publicly anticipate 2008's global financial crisis, more recently he has been focused on the impact of climate change on economic output and is here to discuss this and more with me today. Steve, welcome to TCN TV.
Good to be here.
Steve, you've been calling out the inherent weaknesses in the economics profession's attempts to model climate change. What have they traditionally done, and why don't you think it's working now?
What they've traditionally done is basically repel any attempt by a rival methodology to take over economics. And that happened with the limits to growth back in the 1970s. So William Nordhaus, as it happens, went in and attacked their entire methodology, meaning that they replaced it with their own methodology, which has all these ideas about how capitalism is a system to maximize utility over time, and how it always, if you model as if it's in equilibrium, always returning to equilibrium after a shock and so on. And that is an inappropriate framework for modeling something as dynamic and out of equilibrium as climate change.
Steve, what are you saying is the alternate modelling? What actually is correct here if that is incorrect?
100% of GDP is going to be affected. Even at the simplest level, what I've done in the paper is say, assuming that you'll be unaffected by climate change means that nothing that climate change can do is going to affect anything that happens indoors. Well, if you're indoors, I hope you've got the lights on. I hope you've got air conditioning or heating, okay, depending on the outside temperature. If we then decide, because of the other effects of climate change, and depending on what's happening inside your factory, that we have to cut back energy consumption, get rid of the coal, the fossil fuel sector. So we have an emergency. Climate is obviously killing hundreds of millions of people in some part of the world, and the decision is made to stop using fossil fuel. GDP at the moment would fall by 85%. This is real, this is serious, and this is enormous amounts of energy. In the paper, to give a scale of what would be necessary to cause a 10 degrees Celsius increase in temperature. If we did it ourselves, for the atmosphere alone, it would involve setting off one atom bomb every 1 square kilometre on the planet. If you include the ocean, it's one every 3 or 4 square metres on the planet. That's the amount of additional energy we're pumping, we're retaining by increasing carbon dioxide. And that will completely transform the global climate. So what these economists have done is mistake the local for the global.
Now, when we're discussing these things, it's also just as important to not just be looking at economic modelling, but vested interests. Which do you think is more powerful when it comes to climate change policy?
I think it's actually the belief systems of economists, frankly, because economists have deliberately fought to get the ear of politicians for the last century. If you look at every major economic government department, it's headed by an economist, pretty much. So I think they're actually more powerful than the vested interests. But
so you're not blaming corporations?
Not in this case. Corporations are very happy to promote something like Nordhaus or Lomborg, or the climate change trivializers. They're not actually deniers, they're trivializers. They're happy to promote them, so they get funding and I don't. Okay, but it's fundamentally the fact that when politicians read a document on climate change, they look up their staff looks up in the index to find GDP, goes and checks and see what the implications for GDP are, and they read something written by economists. They don't read the stuff written by the scientists. So the economists are telling them, and this is William Nordhaus, 2018, in a refereed journal paper, American Economic Journal, Macroeconomics, I think it was, a 6 degree increase in temperature will cause an 8.5% fall in GDP. Now, according to scientists, 6 degrees will drive most species on the planet extinct, probably including us.
Now, Steve, moving on to the other central issue of the day, this year has certainly been defined by the COVID-19 global pandemic, sending financial ripples across the global economy. Are you more concerned about the impact of climate change or COVID?
I'm more concerned by climate change because COVID if it was just an isolated exogenous shock from the biosphere, then we could ultimately master it. It's still devastating. If you look at what's going to happen, what has happened so far, there are a few parts of the world that have eliminated. So China, amazingly, is on that list. Southeast Asia in general, New Zealand and maybe Australia, and that's it. Okay, they're COVID-free. Now, if we find COVID has long-term consequences, not just kills a relatively small fraction, say 5 times as many as might die with the flu, but maybe it makes 10% of those who get it have a debilitating lifetime illness, and that seems to be coming out, then we're going to have a fractured globe. Pretty much the Southeast Asia will be COVID-free. Europe and America and Latin America and South America, COVID zones. You won't have international relations between the two segments. That's pretty weird. But ultimately we could manage, whereas with climate change, there's no surviving it if we let it get beyond about, well, certainly beyond, if you get to 3 degrees or 4 degrees, which Nordhaus calls optimal, we won't have this conversation because most likely we'll be dead and the technology won't work.
In spite of those dire predictions, Steve, the world and indeed newspaper headlines or online headlines are dominated with COVID fear. What would you say to get the agenda onto climate change? Because nothing seems to be able to shake COVID off the minds and priorities of our global governments.
At the moment, it has to be the first priority. I'm not going to argue against it, but what it should be doing at the same time is saying, right, the renewal out of this has to be to dramatically reduce the pressure we put upon the biosphere. That's what actually is driving climate change. And that would mean, for example, rapidly bringing forward renewables and nuclear power to replace fossil fuel systems.
So, Steve, if we can perhaps leave on a positive end after the dire predictions, when you look globally speaking, which countries are doing it well? Who should we be perhaps looking to model here in Australia or other countries? Where could we be looking to as the example of how we should be addressing this?
In terms of what's happening with climate change, to some extent what Germany is doing, Germany has made the decision to go heavily renewables, but they've also decided to cut back on nuclear. And at the moment, given the fact that even though nuclear power stations take a hell of a long time to get built, are extremely complicated and so on, they're a very dense source of non-fossil fuel energy after their construction. So I think that's a mistake. But in terms of at least pushing the renewables and moving away from coal and oil, they're doing the right thing.
Clearly you are an economist and you have generated this modelling. We've also discussed the media today. We've discussed governments. If you don't fit into those categories and you want to see change in the area of climate change, what do you advise people to do?
It's something which has to happen at the social level, the collective level. Individuals can do very little to address it. You can try to fly, that's pretty easy right now. Virtually nobody's flying those stupid flights from nowhere that the airlines are doing to try to get some dollars in. They shouldn't be legal. So you can do some things like that, but in general, you have to change the political landscape. And in that sense, I mean, the way that Victorians, for example, are supporting Dan Andrews on suppression contrasts very nicely with the rabid attitude towards him in the Murdoch press. So people, despite what they're being told by the newspapers, are saying we support this strategy, despite the impact on the economy. A similar attitude is necessary for climate change. And that also involves understanding government finances better, because the government has no limits on the amount of money it can create in a situation like this, and it should be doing it. And awareness, getting awareness about how the monetary powers of government, getting awareness about the severity of the situation, and then campaigning for political parties that understand that is about the only thing an individual can do.
Well, Steve, you're certainly doing your part by sharing your insights today. Thank you so much for your time.
You're welcome.
And thank you for watching. Now, if you like what you see, please be sure to like and share the video, subscribe to TCN TV and drop us a comment. Tell us who you would like to see next and what you would like me to ask them. Or if you're an investor, send us an email so we can keep you in the loop with the latest ideas to empower.